Hello, welcome. My name's Paul Jameson, Head of Sales at TwentyEA, and I'm delighted to welcome a star-studded panel today. We're going to be concentrating on lettings today and see what the future holds for the UK rental market, and we've got some real experts on the panel. I'm delighted to welcome Allison Thompson, National Lettings MD of Leaders Romans Group and a member of the Property Mark Board. Welcome, Allison.
Thank you.
We've got Megan 18, Operations Director for Location, and also recently elected Vice President of Arla.
Hello.
And our very own Stuart Ducker, Strategic Solutions Director for 20CI.
Hi, Paul.
So let's jump straight in. Stuart, I'm going to start with you, I think. What is the current state of the UK rental market based on the data we look at?
Yeah, so this data is up to date until the end of July and compared with prior years. And it's by and large, it's not good news, I'm afraid. So there are two major issues, I think, for renters at the minute. So the first of those is just the availability of rental properties. So we're facing a situation where the volume of properties to let at the minute in the UK is at an all-time low. We've never seen it as low as this since 2009 when we've been monitoring the statistics. It's 11.5% down in the last year, 35% down since pre-pandemic. And whilst there has been a small increase in supply, so supply of to-let properties has gone up by 6%, it's just not enough to fill the gap. We're still operating with supply lower than 2019 by about 24%. So availability, finding places, very, very difficult to do. Now, we do see a difference between the price bands in the lettings marketplace. So unfortunately, if you're looking at the cheaper end of the market, so let's say you were in the hunt for an £800 or below price per calendar month property, there is 100,000 less of those on the market today than there was in 2019. And there's 25,000 less than there was last year. So availability, major issue if you're a tenant as it stands at the minute and looking to rent somewhere. The second issue, of course, is because of the lack of supply, prices have gone up. So prices have risen at let agreed status by 9% on last year, 24% from 2019. So you've kind of got a double whammy in terms of the fact that there's not enough properties around for you to rent, and those that are there are much more expensive than they were beforehand. What we've seen within our data, of course, is that this has meant that a lot of renters are choosing to stay put rather than move. So if we cast the clock back to 2019, the average length of residency, not tenancy, length of residency for a tenant was 3.6 years. It's now increased to 4.8. And it's not surprising that that's happening, given the fact that it's such a problem trying to let a property as it stands at the minute.
Great. And before we delve into some of those topics, perhaps let's take a step back. Why are we in the position we are in? How have we got here?
Do you want me to take this one or do you want to take this one?
I'll chip in. You carry on, Megan.
I think this has been on the cards. It's a bit of a perfect storm, really. So it started off with all the taxation of landlords. I think that was 2017 it started, and then slowly became a bigger problem for landlords as their ability to offset their mortgage interest rates on their tax. I think that was a massive, massive blow to the landlords. Alongside that, we've had continuous legislative pushes. So since that same time frame, we've had the Tenant Fee Act come into play. We've had additional regulations with things like electrical safety. And then most recently, the buzzword of everybody, the renters reform, that's the kind of next stinger that we're sort of working through at the moment. So I think, whereas when we came out of the 80s and the early 90s, it was about bringing more landlords into the sector and incentivizing them as such. I think now we're going back in the opposite direction, almost pre-Housing Act, where we're trying to kind of take a little bit of the power away again.
Yeah. And yeah, go on, Az.
Yeah, I think, Megan, you're absolutely right. It's Section 24, that was probably the biggest blow we've seen since, since I've been in the sector, and I've been in the sector nearly 30 years. The other issue that I think is a blow since the Section 24 is the stamp duty land tax and the surcharge, the 3% surcharge, because, I think, the tax relief issue is one thing where, property portfolios were profitable, puts potential landlords into the higher tax bracket, obviously then it becomes less profitable. And then in attracting new investors in, that 3%, especially with the rising prices, that starts to become a bit of a turn-off.
Yeah. And I mean, to throw into the mix, there's you've got the EPC efficiency changes on the horizon. I think a new one is they're looking to quadruple the fines on right to rent checks if you fail there. So, I mean, landlords seem to be public enemy number one, but as far as I'm concerned, it looks like landlords are losing, renters are definitely losing. It's lose-lose for everyone out there at the minute. What should the government be doing to help alleviate this situation?
I think treating landlords like housing providers is probably a good place to start. I think we sometimes talk heavily about investment, and it is an investment of their money, but they are housing providers too. So, it's all well and good scrutinising those housing providers, but as both multiple governments have been in play here, and we've got a massive lack of social housing. Since Maggie Thatcher, sold the social housing with the right to buy, which was an incentive that obviously put a lot of people in their own homes, which is a positive thing. But then the negative slant on that is that's never been replenished. So you've got a social system now trying to be supported by a private system, and it's just not working. So I think that's a massive issue there.
Yeah,
and I think the government are focusing on new legislation rather than dealing with the social housing issue. Let's face it, the government are housing providers via the social housing arena. They're not even doing that properly, yet they're focusing on new legislation. Yeah. So it's just as Megan said, it's just a double whammy.
Yeah, and I think, Stuart, we've talked about this before, but I think there's a shortfall of around 4 million houses in this country, a mixture of social housing and private, and until that's sorted, that we're going to have these issues for a long time to come, I think. I mean, Allison, there are regional differences. So if we look at available stock, Stuart says it's down in all regions, and that's correct. But I mean, looking at the data in Northern Ireland and the Northeast, we're kind of 60% down on available stock since 2019. Places like Wales are over 50%. You obviously have a good, through your role with Leaders Romans Group, and obviously a national group, there is a bit of a north-south divide and regional differences. Can you perhaps just touch on some of that for us?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, whilst we don't cover, areas such as the northeast, we do cover areas such as the northwest, and a big cohort in the Midlands, and we definitely see more available stock in those areas. Now, that's a mixture of new instructions and maybe a little bit more of a transient market in some of those areas. So people are still moving out, albeit that the tenure is much longer, and there is obviously less available stock for people to go looking for. But we can see in the Leaders Romans Group network, we can see a real difference between some of the sort of Midlands and around that sort of section, Sheffield, Liverpool, Leeds, all of those areas are still really quite healthy in terms of their stock levels, whereas you can come further south, in particular sort of around the outer London area and maybe into sort of Surrey and down to the south coast. It's almost depleted of stock. Areas that perhaps a town would have had traditionally 200 to 300 available stock at any one time, we're talking under 10. Under 10 in some of those areas, whereas you go to sort of Sheffield, Liverpool, those sorts of areas, and we're still in the thousands. So the big cities seem to be holding. Manchester still really, really, really good. So it's not as good as it could be, but there's definitely a big shift between north and south for sure.
Okay.
I was just going to say the other thing that we haven't pointed out yet is that the dynamics have changed. So you mentioned Thatcher. So in the early 90s, I believe it was 80% owner occupied, or those sorts of numbers. And since then, obviously, we've had an influx of labour from the European Union, and I now believe that the owner occupied figures are 67%. So the problem is only going to get worse as houses become more expensive to buy, if that makes sense. And this is I hear the word housing crisis quite a lot in the media that I read, and you could argue that that's a little bit trying to escalate the problem or whatever, but genuinely my view is that for the government at the minute, their biggest single challenge with respect to property is the affordability and availability of rental properties, the private rental sector. And they just have to start rolling back some of these changes or provide incentives for large firms to be able to do that more rapidly than they're doing today. And that's the only thing that's going to make this abate, short of a huge lack of supply, actually dealing with those supply side metrics, dealing with the issues of landlords. And otherwise it is just going to get worse, I'm afraid.
It's interesting as well, don't you think, that when you look at the data that you've provided about the different areas and available stock, that two of the areas most heavily hitted are Wales and Scotland, which are also the areas that are most heavily regulated. So, when you look at that data, you sort of do question where the logic is that, for example, in Scotland, it's so severe, that now they've got rent caps, they've got eviction freezes, they've got everything going for them at the moment.
Yeah.
And yet their stock is down, looks like around 43% looking at this graph here. That's huge, and if that had that same ripple effect across the whole of England as well, that would be a real problem for us.
Yeah. And I suppose the result of all of this is rents are going up. Now, if we delve into the detail of that, I think what we're seeing is the average rent in 2023 is over £1,200 per month now. It was only, well, I say only, it was £975 in 2020. That's a huge increase in just 3 years. There is a real issue with this affordability. Like, where do we see rental prices going? Can they go much further?
I would say they still have a little way to go, but I would anticipate that they will start to plateau. I would say probably towards the back end of 2024. It's interesting though, because what do they say? Tenants, it's about 30% of their income goes on rent, and I don't know what you're seeing, Megan, but our rent arrears are lower than they've ever been. It's an interesting one. It is no doubt there is a cost of living crisis and an affordability issue. We're not seeing that actually impacting in terms of the rents that we're collecting. We're certainly seeing an increase in people seeking advice and seeking help and asking for payment plans and other such, there are lots of other things that tenants can do to seek help with paying their rent. But it's not yet impacting in the way that perhaps we thought it would.
Yeah.
I think there's a fear element though to that, because ultimately as a tenant, you lose your home because you're not paying your rent on time, or you're not paying your rent at all. Well, you're then going back into almost like this, joking aside, it's like the Hunger Games. You're going back into that arena, and suddenly you're competing with all these other people, but you've now got a bad reference to come alongside with you. And I think it's a fear element, and that people prioritize what they're going to pay first. And I think that's ultimately where it's come to. Interestingly, I think during the sort of lockdown period, rent was the thing that people went, well, I'm not going to pay that. Whereas now it doesn't feel that way. But I do think that, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs as people, that right at the bottom is a home and to feel safe. And I think that people are protecting that, which, is the right thing to do.
Yeah. And I think we can all agree it's pretty tough for renters out there at the minute. I think the assumption in the media is that landlords are greedy and they're putting rents up and they're making lots of money. But actually, I don't think that's the case. I read something recently that apparently 2/3 of tenancies don't increase and actually some of them decrease. I think the majority of landlords are fairly reasonable and fair, especially in this market. And I read something in Savills that landlords are making less now than they have in the last 16 years. So I think it is really tough for everyone out there. And we touched on it earlier, the Renters Reform Bill. That's the kind of latest idea from government and that's going through right now. Can we just perhaps touch on that? Just a bit of a summary of what that is, what they're trying to do, and whether we think that will work?
There's loads of points to really, where do you start with it? I think the big headlines are the abolishment of the Section 21, which is our ability to serve notice, or what the media are calling our no-fault evictions. The reality we find as letting agents is that people don't tend to evict good tenants. So there's normally a reason, which, from what we're getting as an indication from the government, they will protect. In the Section 8, they're going to increase our mandatory and discretionary grounds for possession. So in theory, that will be there. I think for me, the biggest concern for that would be our court systems can't currently support that. It's around, well, the last time I checked, it's around 13 months to get a tenant through an eviction process.
Wow.
So, realistically, if we've then suddenly got to increase that by all these people, we might have a bit of an issue there. So for me, it would be welcoming more of a court, a more reformed court system for housing, I think.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. It's a headline grabber, the no fault eviction. We did a survey of our landlords. 90% of them have never used a Section 21. The tenants are mostly ended by the tenant, not the landlord. So they're not greedy. They're not evicting good tenants. In the survey, coming back to what you said about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, etc., we find that the most important thing to a landlord isn't necessarily rent, isn't necessarily how much they're paying the agent. It's a good quality tenant comes up there all the time. I think coming back to the Renters Reform Bill, there's some good parts and there's some poor parts. I think, to be honest with you, it's going to be really odd because a Section 21 enables a landlord to gain possession of their property. If they remove fixed term tenancies, ironically, it might be even easier for a landlord to gain possession of a property. It might be quicker. So I just don't know what problem it's trying to solve, because I don't think there was a problem in the first place. But there are some good points to it, making sure that, there's a level playing field in terms of housing benefit, children, pets with properties. The property portal, I think that would be really useful, transparency across for landlords and tenants. So there's some good parts, but the headline grabbers are the bits that I don't think have been really well thought through.
The pets one's a really interesting one, I think, because something that got severely overlooked during the Tenant Fee Act, when they banned tenant fees but also capped deposit sizes, is that those with pets would usually say, well, I'll pay an extra 2 weeks deposit. And that was an ability to keep their pet there. Whereas landlords have just gone, nope, not doing it now. Why would I do that? And so people are then having to surrender their pets. Rescue centres are then completely bulging at the seams. So this idea that you could have almost like an insurance policy that the tenant would pay for, I really welcome that. And I think that that's a positive thing that could come out of the reform, depending on how it's structured.
But again, I was talking only the other day to an insurance broker about this, because it says in the Renters Reform Bill that landlords will request for tenants to have insurance to cover pets damage, but no insurance company will insure a known peril. And I have a pet, my pet's damaged my house, and it's a known peril. No insurer is going to do it. So it'd be really interesting to see what they think is going to happen there, because I think it's a great thing, but I don't know quite what insurance is going to be able to be provided.
It feels a bit like the blind leading the blind, that we get an idea and then you get exactly that. This is a positive, but what about this?
Yeah.
And I think that
it hasn't quite been thought through.
We haven't got the clarity that we're absolutely grasping for at the moment.
So if I'm a letting agent watching this video, it's pretty tough for landlords as well. Stuart, I think we've got data to suggest that there's quite a few landlords exiting the sector.
Of course.
If I was a letting agent, have you got any practical advice to kind of attract and keep landlords within the sector right now in this kind of market?
I would say to any agent watching this, let's not make this a race to the bottom. Let's give good quality advice. Make sure your staff are well trained. Let's make sure that we can ensure we're demonstrating good value. And let's keep our landlords close. Let's talk to them. Don't alienate them. Let's bring them in and talk to them and reassure them, and just make sure that we're offering good quality expertise, because we've all been in the industry a long time, and we can offer that reassurance. And agents out there, just please don't make this a race to the bottom. Just hold your nerve and just give your landlords the best possible advice you can.
I think it's a big opportunity for us as letting agents. And I think for me, my initial reaction was to panic, which I think everybody's initial reaction was to panic. But actually, when you start digging through it on the surface, it's an opportunity that, we are going to lose landlords. There's no getting around that. We will do, the conditions are sort of supporting that. But what we are going to be left with is landlords that actually want to be landlords, that can afford to be landlords. So when things get pushed and issues start arising, so you're dealing with really good quality landlords as well. So I think there is a positive slant on that, and ultimately you can sit here and you can panic to your heart's content. We are all doing our best, and the best thing that anyone can do is use your voice with your local MP through. If you're part of a membership body like Property Mark, use that voice, because that will only help. But if you're not willing to do that, then just sit back and hope for the best.
Can I just ask you a question? I mean, do you think that, obviously we're all aware of the prior situation where, something like 80% of landlords only own one property. Do we think that big companies is the answer to this? So, more buy to rent, more build to rent.
Yeah, I do.
Taken more seriously, that kind of thing?
I can't remember where I read, but I think certainly our data at LRG, only 50% of our landlords have got a mortgage. And, the majority, we're seeing a shift in the dynamic between what was, back in the day, the accidental landlord, 1 or 2 properties. We're seeing those exit, but the professional
incorporated ones,
exactly that they can withstand some of this. They can offset things here and there, and I think there'll be a consolidation of the sector, and it'll end up being more institutionalized landlords.
We talked about this slightly earlier in terms of the fact that a couple of the companies that we're working with have moved from build to rent because of the fact that they can't rent enough properties to buy to rent. So we're talking about big investment vehicles that are starting to purchase properties, and one of the reasons as to why they're doing that is because they think they can get a yield on it because of the fact that the rental price is now where it is. So it was just interesting to hear your thoughts in terms of, you think companies stepping in might be part of obviously it can't happen fast enough for the issues that we've got at the minute.
The government seem to be quite supportive of the build to rent industry, and I think that for them they can mass regulate something like that quite easily. It's much easier on a larger scale to regulate something like build to rent. But I think actually, if you look at it generationally, we'll go with that, generationally, that millennials, which are kind of our typical renters at the moment in terms of bracket, as a millennial myself, like, we love that renting culture of, you're buying a lifestyle with a build to rent, you're buying your social circles and everything, and it's all in one place. And we're quite a transient generation. I think that's why the build to rent really works for our generation. And I think that's why we've had such big success with that. Great.
Well, I think let's leave it there. We've covered some really good topics, some really good insight. Perhaps before we close, I think as we've discussed, it's pretty tough out there for all parties in the letting sector. What, in terms of a closing remark, or just for the rest of the year, or perhaps the years ahead, what do you see as the outlook? Do you think it's got to improve, or do you think there's more gloom on the way?
I personally think that we'll kind of scoot along at the same pace that we are at the moment until we've got a bit more clarity about the renters reform. The renters reform in reality could look very different. If we then have an election and it doesn't go through before that, we could have a very different reform. So I don't personally see anything massively changing, but I will say, as agents, this is your opportunity to shape the narrative. So make sure that you're not adding fear to that mass scare.
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. And there's talk of housing crisis, etc. It's not broken. It's not broken. It's challenging, but it's definitely not broken. And as we know, these things, a healthy property market just needs activity, just needs transactions. And obviously right now we seem to be sort of stalling a little bit, both in the sales market and in the lettings market, but something will give. It always does. Yeah. It always does. And then the flow will start again. It might take a little while, but nothing is broken. It's just difficult. And like Megan says, we'll scoot along.
And just out of interest, Keir Starmer's constituency is St Pancras, which has 90% of people renting. So at the end of the day, he has to sort something out, I guess, if he gets elected.
If elected. Right. Allison, Megan, Stuart, thanks for a really, really great chat today.
Thank you.
And
thank you.
Really interesting stuff.
Thank you.